The silence that followed. Torrance, California. March 1971. A Saturday morning, 9:47 a.m. The Santa Ana winds had been blowing since Wednesday, the kind of dry, insistent winds that stripped the hillsides and made the air taste like the edge of something burning. The parking lot of the shopping center on Cabrillo Avenue held perhaps 30 cars, their hoods already warm to the touch despite the early hour. Through the plate glass windows of the building at the far end of the lot, anyone passing could see the interior in pale cross-sections. The white walls, the mounted flags, the rows and rows of white uniforms moving in coordinated sequence like a field of grain disturbed by a single wave. Chuck Norris's school occupied the kind of commercial space that says nothing about itself from the outside, the same storefront bones that housed a dry cleaner in one incarnation and a tax office in another. Inside, it was something else, not by virtue of decoration or ceremony. There were no ornate scrollwork or gilded displays of trophies, though the trophies existed, stacked in a back office in boxes, because Norris had never been interested in the theater of achievement. What made the interior into something was harder to name. It had to do with the quality of attention in the room. With the way approximately 200 people, ranging in age from 11 to 53, stood in lines and moved their bodies through forms that required them to be, for the duration of the movement, nothing other than present. This was 1971. Chuck Norris was 31 years old and had been a competitive fighter for a decade. He held a black belt in Tang Soo Do, had earned rank in Kenpo, and had spent 3 years winning championships at a level that American karate had rarely seen from anyone who hadn't trained in Asia from childhood. He had been world middleweight champion since 1968, and what that number, 3 years, concealed was the compounding work it represented, the daily practices, the thousands of sparring rounds, the competitions across the country, the injuries absorbed and trained through, the constant recalibration of technique against opponents who were themselves excellent. Winning the title was one thing. Holding it was another order of discipline entirely. But the academy, the chain of schools he'd been building since returning from Korea, was something separate. Something Norris talked about less, perhaps because the competitive circuit offered external validation, and the teaching offered something that didn't need validation to exist. He had, by 1971, taught hundreds of students. He was genuinely good at it in ways that surprised people who expected a champion to be primarily interested in replicating himself. Norris was interested in the student, in finding the specific adjustment, the particular cue, the moment of technical breakthrough that was different for every person, and that no amount of generalized instruction could manufacture. He had the patience that real mastery creates, which is not the patience of a slow person, but the patience of someone who has made peace with the distance between where students are and where they need to go. On this particular Saturday, he was leading a combined class, an unusual arrangement, 200 students from several levels, an open practice that he held a few times a year to give beginners the experience of working in formation with advanced practitioners, and to give advanced practitioners the humbling experience of being watched by beginners. The room smelled of exertion and floor wax. The formations moved through the first of the Pyongan forms, the kata that Kim had drilled into Norris in Korea, the foundation beneath all other foundations, and the sound of 200 feet striking the floor in unison produced something that was, in certain moments, close to music. A woman named Sandra Chu, 14 years old, stood in the third row from the back. She'd been training for 8 months and had recently passed her first belt examination. She was small and precise in her movements, the kind of student who compensates for lack of physical power with exactness. She would later become an instructor herself, would teach for 20 years in the same region, and would say in interviews that she thought about what happened that morning, whenever a student of hers encountered discouragement. A man named David Park, 41, stood near the center of the room in the intermediate section. He was Korean-American, born in Los Angeles, a civil engineer who had come to the school not for competition or fitness, but because his son trained there, and because he'd found, unexpectedly, that the practice of forms quieted something in his mind that nothing else quieted. He had no martial arts background. He had, Norris thought, exceptional natural sensitivity, a body that listened before his conscious mind did. At 9:52, the front door opened. He walked in without removing his shoes. That was the first thing. The shoes, expensive, European, making a sound on the floor that was distinct from the general silence of a room full of people in bare feet. He was 47 or 48, with the settled, satisfied posture of a man who has decided his conclusions in advance of his experiences. He wore a black GI with a belt that was also black, embroidered with something in gold thread that was either a rank insignia or a decoration, and it was impossible from across the room to know which. He had, in the regional martial arts community, a name. Norris knew it, and we will not use it here, not because it is unimportant, but because the man himself was not ultimately what mattered about that morning. What mattered was that he had decided at some point before arriving that this visit was an assessment. that he had opinions about the way Norris was running his school, about the curriculum, about the mixing of levels in a single class, and that these opinions were formed and correct and deserving of an audience. He had said as much to other instructors in the region. He had made observations, in the particular tone of men who use the language of observation to deliver verdicts, about the commercialization of martial arts in California, about the difference between legitimate lineage and tournament circuit celebrity, and about whether a man who spent his time winning trophies was, at bottom, equipped to be a teacher. He stopped walking when he reached roughly the midpoint of the room. The class continued around him for a moment, 200 people in motion, a white river parting briefly around a rock. And then, because they were disciplined and paying attention, some of the nearest students began to lose the beat of the form as the intrusion registered in their peripheral vision. Norris, standing at the front, saw all of this. He brought the class to a stop with a single word: rest. And the formations settled, and the room went still. 200 people in loose, standing position, breathing, waiting. Some of them looked toward the center of the room. Most of them, trained by now to orient their attention toward the front, regardless of what their curiosity suggested, kept their eyes forward. The man at the center of the room began to speak. He spoke in a formal, organized manner that suggested he had rehearsed, at least partially. He spoke about rank and lineage. He used the word traditional several times, in the way that people use it when they mean to say that something in front of them is not that. He made a comment about mixing beginner and advanced students in the same session that contained within its technical framing a clear implication about judgment and competence. He said that in his school, he paused here just long enough for the parenthetical status of his school to land, this was not how instruction was handled. He spoke for perhaps 90 seconds. The room was absolutely quiet the entire time. 200 people, some of them children, some of them decades older than Norris, a man from Korea who'd come to this country and built something from nothing, training in a room behind a dry cleaner because the rent was manageable. A woman who'd had a hard year and came 3 times a week because this was the 1 hour in her life where her mind was not somewhere else. A teenage boy who had been failing school before he started training and was now, incrementally, learning that failure was information rather than verdict. 200 specific lives in their white uniforms, waiting. Chuck Norris listened to all 90 seconds without expression. When the man finished speaking, there was a silence that lasted perhaps 5 full seconds. 5 seconds of silence in a room with 200 people in it is a long time. The Santa Ana wind pressed against the plate glass windows. Someone near the back shifted weight from one foot to the other, the floor responding with a sound like a whisper. Then Norris said, "Thank you for coming." That was all. No argument, no demonstration of credential, no reference to his championships or his lineage or his years under Kim or his friendship with men who had forgotten more about martial arts than the man in the center of the room would ever know. No elevation of voice, no tightening of jaw, no performance of restraint that would itself be a form of aggression. "Thank you for coming." He turned back to his students. He said, "From the beginning." And the 200 people lifted their hands and set their feet and began again. The man in the center of the room stood for a moment, stood in the exact position he'd occupied while speaking, the position of someone accustomed to responses, to the back and forth that would have allowed him to continue, to escalate, to press his advantage, and found himself standing in a river that had simply resumed flowing. He was not ejected. He was not humiliated in any visible way. He was, in a manner far more complete, made irrelevant. He left at 10:04. Sandra Chu, in the third row from the back, did not understand precisely what she'd witnessed. She was 14, and the technical content of what the man had said was largely beyond her. But she understood the shape of the thing. She understood it the way animals understand weather, not by analysis, but by atmosphere. She felt the room during those 5 seconds of silence. She felt the quality of Norris's stillness. She felt the difference between a man who proves himself by responding and a man who proves himself by not needing to. Years later, when she was teaching her own students and one of them became upset by an unfair criticism from an outside voice, she would say, "The answer to noise isn't more noise." She did not tell them where the sentence came from. She wasn't sure she could explain the provenance. It had come from a Saturday morning in Torrance, from a man who said 5 words instead of the 500 he could have said, and walked back to his students. David Park, the civil engineer in the intermediate section, watched the whole thing from the center of the room with the particular clarity that comes to people who are not personally invested in the conflict's outcome. He told his son about it that evening. His son was 11 and playing with something at the kitchen table and half listening. "What did he do?" the son asked. "Nothing," Park said. "That was the thing." His son looked up then, because the tone of the word carried something he recognized as important, even if he couldn't name it. Nothing as an active choice. Nothing as the hardest possible answer. Nothing as the demonstration that required the most out of a man who had learned over years and under a Korean teacher with hands like carved wood that the highest expression of any technique is knowing when not to use it. The man who had walked into the school went back to his own students and his own lineage and his own conclusions about Chuck Norris, which did not substantially change. He was not converted by the experience. He continued to hold his opinions, which is the prerogative of free people, and some of those opinions were even correct. He was a decent teacher in his own tradition, and his students respected him, and this is worth saying because the morning's encounter was not his destruction. It was simply a moment in which he encountered a form of discipline that his framework had not prepared him to recognize. He mentioned the visit once to another instructor as evidence that Norris was running more of a commercial operation than a legitimate school. Look at those class sizes. Look at the mix levels. The other instructor had been in the room. He said nothing. He changed the subject. He had been there for the 5 seconds of silence and for the thank you for coming. And he had felt in those 5 seconds something he could not argue with. The class ended at 11. The students bowed out in formation. Norris walked through the room as he always did after class, stopping at one student, then another, a technical note here, an encouragement there, the specific and personal attention that the class format didn't allow for, but that the after-class time did. He reached Sandra Chu and observed her stance from one angle, then another, and said a single thing about the position of her rear heel. She adjusted. He nodded. He did not mention what had happened. Not that day, not in any class that followed. It was not, in his understanding, the kind of thing that required mention. It had been a moment, and the moment had been answered, and the answer was in the record of what the room had done. It had kept going. The forms continued. The floors absorbed impact. The Santa Ana wind moved through the parking lot outside, stirring the dust of a dry California spring, carrying the smell of something burning somewhere distant, something that would eventually put itself out. Torrance, California, March 1971.